Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Lord High Summoner, or LHS, or Zachary, if you are a real weirdo. I've tried to make this video so many times. I've run into every tech issue imaginable. I've had my camera shooting in slow-mo for some reason. I've had corrupted audio. I've had corrupted video. I've had me issues where I just didn't like what I said. I went on too long. I've gone too short. I'm really hoping for my own mental health that this cut is finally the cut, because it is preventing me from moving forward. I got in my own head. I made the last video and I was like, okay, let's go. And then I ran into all the issues and I've lost that momentum. I've lost that inertia, and it's really hard to get back in, especially with all the issues. It feels really defeating and deflating when I do the recording. I feel really good and then I can't use it. So I'm hoping today that we're finally on the other side of this and we figured it out and we can start moving forward, because I want to just make something. I want to get something out. I don't care if it's perfect anymore. I just want to get this out so that I can start making content. But I can't do that unless I get over this hump. And it's very important that we get over this hump, because this video feels to me like the linchpin of everything. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the games that made me. This is a video that I was inspired from Quinn's Quest. A year or two ago, they made a post on their Patreon that covered this very topic, and I really liked it. What better way to learn about somebody than them telling you about their biggest sources of inspiration? So I wanted to take that and kind of give it my own spin, because I think for me, my biggest inspirations aren't really games in the hobby. My journey through all of this didn't start till later in life. I didn't play my first game of D&D until I was 20. I was in the military and kind of played a handful of sessions of 3.5. I didn't play my first regular campaign until I was out of the Navy and going to college in Rochester, and I was going to a local game store. So for me, I didn't have games actually that led me to the hobby. I'd been aware of D&D. I'm a nerd. I know things vaguely, had heard about it, but it wasn't something that I got to experience firsthand. And so I came to this hobby from a lot of different inroads, adjacent paths. I was a big RPG fan, like video games, JRPGs. Final Fantasy X is my favorite game of all time. Things like that drove me close to here. But there's a reality where I go down an entirely different road. I don't get into TTRPGs. I just get into writing, and that brings us to game number one that made me. When I was about 12 or 13, I was an avid visitor of the website Pokemon Crater. Some of you may know Pokemon Crater as the browser-based Pokemon game that let you basically play the Pokemon games online. I never played the game. I was entirely someone who spent their time within the forums of Pokemon Crater. And specifically, there was a role-playing forum. And so my first taste, I estimate, of role-playing games was in forum roleplay. And that, I think, more than anything else, has been the biggest influencer on me, how I look at games, how I run games, how I play, because there were no rules in the forum roleplays, at least not mechanics, at the very least. It wasn't play by post. I've played play by post now where you're rolling virtual dice, you've got Discord bots, things like that. There was none of that. It was a guy put up, a girl would put up a post and say, hey, here's what I want to run. And it would be either their own world or it would be exploring an IP they liked. So, hey, I want to do an X-Men role play where we're all playing, kind of people in a academy setting with powers, and it's like a slice of life. And people would then apply. The person who put it up would say what the tone was going to be, what they were looking for, give an example of a character who they were going to be playing, and all of that. And then you would apply. You would put your character forward, who you were thinking about what powers, what, descriptions, things like that. And different people had different application processes. There were some people that would make you fill out multiple pages to, like, show that you were dedicated to this and that you had the ability to write. Some people just like, give me a couple sentences, right? And then you would play the game, and it was a collaborative effort. There were certainly people who were doing it at a very high level, and I just wasn't one of those, especially starting out. I am so glad that the evidence of me learning how to write and be a person is not as evident as it would be these days. I think the Pokemon Creator Forums died, and all of those records are expunged from the internet. Thank God. And, case in point, I remember one of the first ones, I think, my memory is a little my memory's a little fuzzy, was an anime tournament fighter role play. And it was bring your favorite character in and we're just going to fight. Looking back, I have no idea how that was supposed to work because there were no mechanics, there were no rules. It was literally just you trying to outwit somebody and get them to admit that you beat them, that they couldn't think of a reasonable way to escape whatever situation you would put them in, and then they would lose. And that amount of trust, thinking back, is insane. Because I remember, like, oh, I'm not going to lose. I can think outside the box. And, like, right? Like, Gary Stu, Mary Sue's type mentality of, like, oh, I can do anything. There wasn't no agreement on power scaling, power leveling. You were just taking your favorite character in. And if they were your favorite character, you probably thought they were fairly strong. And I remember I got in 2 rounds. The first round, I don't even remember who I fought. It was unmemorable. I remember I used Dragon of the Darkness Flame to beat them, and everybody agreed that there was no coming back because they let it hit them. Very simple. Now, the second round, I remember, I fought a guy playing as Cloud, and he quit. He forfeited because I was too ignorant and obstinate and didn't bow down to the fact that, well, according to the power scaling and the feats that Cloud has shown off and all of the lore, he would easily be able to dispatch Hiei because of X, Y, and Z. Oh, you're going to do this? I'm going to get out of it. Well, they didn't agree that that was realistic. And so they quit, and then it died. But I learned a lot from my time spent on the forums. I learned how to tell a collaborative story. I learned how to work with people. And that is, to this day, what I set out to do when I set up these games. I think one of the things that I've noticed in my time in the hobby is that there's such an animosity between GMs and players, and kind of honestly players and players trying to do what they want to do, right? And if you are a GM and you say, oh, I want to tell a story, immediately the picture that's conjured in people's minds is, oh, you're that kind of GM. You're a my story GM, right? And I think, largely we've all experienced bad players and bad GMs. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, right? I cut my teeth in a form where the GM, the creator of the game, was in the mud with you and kind of threw their hands off the wheel to experience it with everybody else and worked with everybody else. And there were moments where they would step in to move the plot forward as an omniscient narrator or anything, but their character was at the whim of everything else, just as everybody else was. And so that's how I kind of engage with the story. I am looking to tell competent and compelling and satisfying stories. So a lot of people will say, like, oh, my story, so, like, why don't you just write a book? And I'm like, well, I don't know what happens. I won't know what happens until it happens. I have spoken privately. I am somebody who has fudged in the past. I believe in it as a tool to be used, right? And it's not that I'm fudging to achieve a result. I'm doing it to have story beats accentuated. I'm turning crits into misses or misses into crits, things like that. I'm never going to kill a player on a fudged crit or anything like that. I'm never going to have them not kill something based off of a fudge. It's that middle section that the back and forth. I'm really kind of putting a thumb on the scale to make it more exciting and exhilarating. Having a my story doesn't mean I'm obsessed with success, which is, the argument that I hear from people all the time. Failure is just as much a part of a story as success is. You want the obstacles and the challenges. You want them to overcome them, but not necessarily. I've killed players in my campaigns. I'm not somebody that, keeps consequences from them. I just want to, there's a pact, I feel. We all sit on a table if we want something satisfying. And sometimes the randomness of dice just don't do that. And that, to me, stems from all of the control being around the players, of us all agreeing that things happen. And the type of people that are drawn to those role plays were people who, would let bad things happen to their character because it's what would be realistic. And so that kind of idea is also stuck with me too. I blend actor and author stance. What is the best set of actions to happen right here, but what is realistic that my character would do as well? And I serve both of those kind of ideas in the interest of the story. And those are all things that I've learned from the roleplay community. Not only that, but there was like that sense of, because the application process, that we were all bought in. There was that certain level of familiarity with an IP or with an idea of a story that we were all going in with. And there wasn't like a session zero either. It was literally people coming up and saying, this is the character I want to play. And then you would read that, okay, cool. And then maybe you'd base a character that would be like that. Maybe there was some DMs that would happen like, hey, you're this character. Maybe we can be friends, whatever. But a lot of the time it was just, all right, we're throwing this all in, let's go. And then it would start. And, there was no rules for how many posts you would go, how long you would go. And it was chaos. And I look back at it, I'm like, how in the world did we do this? No mechanics, no rules outside of don't be dicks, right? Like there were kind of X cards that were set up at the beginning of like, hey, we're going to do this type of game, but we're not going to do this, and this. So, no sex, no over the top violence, and no whatever, right? And we go, okay, cool, I can abide by those rules. But everything else was, fair game at the table. And it was that rule of cool and rule of vibes. As long as the vibes were good, everybody was happy. And so that's what I seek to do when I set up games and play games. And all of that stems from my time playing in forum role play. And I don't think anything else that I'm going to talk about today matters as much as my time spent on the forums. And game number 2, that also isn't a game, because I moved every year as a kid. I didn't have that community that is traditionally tied with the TTRPG community and D&D and all of these things. I'd been aware of it, but had no connection to it, didn't know anybody who played, anything like that. And so really the factor that kept me close and pulled me in and made me more and more interested was content creators and people telling stories about their games. First and foremost, one of the content creators just as a whole who has influenced me in a myriad of ways is Spoonie Experiment. When Spoonie was doing Counter Monkey and telling the stories, I was captivated. This is so cool. This is so different than anything that I've ever experienced. And I loved it. I didn't have any idea what went on and how you played these games or anything like that. It was very high level, kind of concepts for me. I'm like, okay, there's your dice, stuff happens, you roll, whatever. I had no idea what any of that really meant. But, him talking about his cyberpunk game where they were beating up bad guys and rivals and the corpos by having like drug-laced acid in squirt guns because that was per the rules. That story, to this day, I go back and watch it. I go back and watch a lot of those Counter Monkey stories and, get something away. And I think like to that extent as well, the whole community that rose up around telling funny stories and telling the stories that happened at their tables, was what got me in. Wanting to experience that, wanting to have that, at the table, forum role play and, play by post and all that, great. But having that at the table and as it happening with everybody in person, that was something that was like, oh, I really want that. And in the same vein, green tech stories from like 4chan and Reddit and things like that, those also really pulled me in. Some of them are humorous, some of them were horror stories, not horror as the genre, but horror as like, oh my God, what kind of person would do this? And I learned a lot about, okay, like here's what to look out for. Here's like people like, oh, these are faux pas, right? I learned a lot about the culture without ever playing the game. And then came Matt Colville. I learned so much about TTRPGs as a whole from Matt Colville. I have never considered Colville a D&D creator because he doesn't really talk about the system and the mechanics all that much. What he talks about is how to tell stories and compel players and how to put politics into a game, or how to have really good interactions between NPCs and factions and your player characters and all of those things. So hear him talk about all of these different topics within running the game. That was massive. Having him talk about, changing a monster's HP on the fly during a fight because, it didn't make sense, or letting, everybody gets one cool thing in combat before it ends. All these types of concepts really jived with me. The type of games that he would talk about really interested me. And then the stories that he would tell from his tables and, then his campaign diaries from the game he was running. I took a lot away, and I still go back to this day and rewatch those videos to take a little bit more inspiration from. And then as of late, the person that I take the most from is Quinn's. I have fallen in love with him, and I think it's very similar in the style from Colville in a certain way, where we're just talking about the games themselves. Yes, Quinn's does get more into the mechanics, but I think what Quinn's does better than kind of anybody right now is talk about what they like about the game, right? What they are getting out of it. And I don't agree with kind of Quinn's in totality. Quinn's talked about Vaesen, for example, and talked about all the cool things about it, and built it up throughout the review, and then at the end he's like, and I will never run this again. I didn't like it because X, Y, and Z. And by that point I'd already been sold, and I was like, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I don't think that's a deal breaker for me. I think I can do that better than what you are saying. I still want to run Vaesen, right? And that positivity of talking about the experiences and the feelings and what it invokes and all of that is what I love about this community and this hobby as a whole, and what I am looking to generate anytime that I think about, talk about, or execute within the hobby. I'm not somebody that looks at a game and says, okay, what does it want me to do? I think that is a way to play, and a lot of people do that, right? Oh, the mechanics are telling me they want to be used like this. I don't look at games like that. I look at games of like, okay, here's what it is. What can I do with it? And I think a really good example is something like Triangle Agency, right? It is, all about the bureaucracy, and it's tongue in cheek and all of this, but it like very much cares about that bureaucracy in setting. And when I look at that, I'm like, I want to run Yu Yu Hakusho in Triangle Agency. And every time I tell that to people, they're like, you're insane. That doesn't make any sense. I'm like, nah, it totally makes sense. You're playing the spirit detectives and all of that, and it's quirky and it's kooky, and I think that could really work, and so like I take that everywhere. I don't believe in the sacred cows. I don't think of designers as like these great men. I think they're just people like you and I. And I think every time that you sit in the GM chair, you become a game designer. And I know there's a lot of people that disagree with that, and know like the system should be revered and the people who made it, like their vision should be honored. And I just don't believe in that. I think that these games are games to be broken apart and put back together however you want and see fit. there's never been a mechanic that I've seen that I didn't think I could throw away. Right. And I think I've learned that over the course of, from the forums to Colville to Quinn's to certain less Quinn's, because he does want to experience what the game is telling him to do. But through that, I've learned that oh no, I don't want to do that as much. I want to kind of cultivate my own experience. And that does require a certain table. And that's something I've learned. Right. And so the third game that made me, we finally get to a game. That's Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. When I got out of the Navy, I went down to my local game shop because I wanted to play D&D, and I joined an Adventurously group, and it just happened to line up perfectly. There was a GM there who had just shown up and didn't have people to play with, and there was a group of people, friends, that had shown up too, and they're like, we want to do Adventurously, and I was just the tag on to their group of friends, and it was magical. We played Hoard of the Dragon Queen. And I know a lot of people don't have great experiences on that. I loved it. It was a great time. And I loved that character I played. I played a bard who then went in to be a bard lock. When we hit level 2, I went warlock and had flavored it that I had found this, ancient book that then connected me to a patron. And the patron that I found was Pandorum. For those of you who don't know, Pandorum is from 3.5, the Elder Evil book. And Pandorum is essentially a weapon that kills gods. And it is separated between its physical body and its mind. And if they ever come back and are rejoined, it's bad news for the gods. And my character was kind of dedicated to bringing Pandorum back so that it could kill the gods and it could usher in a new age of man, of mortals, sort of like a reverse Pirates of the Caribbean, where they're freeing Calypso to, bring chaos and unruliness back to the seas. I wanted to bring the control back into the hands of men, because we've been too long the playthings of the deities. And of course, Hoard of the Dragon Queen is about, going up against the dragon cultists who want to revive Tiamat. And it was very funny. It lined up. Every time we'd go up and fight the dragon cultists, whoever was left alive, I would start recruiting them to my cult. Hey, my cult kicked your cult's ass. You should join me. And it worked for the most part. Everybody at the table was on board. The GM was super supportive. And it was this fun little meta game on top of everything, right? The other players were playing dumb about it. And I was, trying to keep them from catching on to my character, kind of doing this because he didn't know how they would react. And I remember we got to the point where there's a big trip, a montage moment on the road up to Waterdeep. And it was random event tables. And the random event we rolled had us encounter an elven lord from a long lost civilization. We chased him. He was in a deer form. We chased him into this ruined temple structure. And as soon as he crossed the threshold, he turned back into the elf king. And, he asked us to help. And we either help him or we could kill him for his golden fleece or whatever. And so my character helped him on the condition that he would make me his heir, because I was going to be, king of an elf land. And he's like, but the kingdom doesn't exist. I was like, let me worry about that. So he did, and we freed him. And then kind of once, I think we were right outside of Waterdeep or whatever, there's an assassination attempt, and it happened to be randomly rolled to me. And I passed my perception check. It was bone spur poison thing that was hidden in oatmeal. And then if you ate it, it would make it so you wouldn't be able to breathe. So I caught it, fished it out, and I put it in his food as a way to take him out. That I had, he notarized, he did all the paperwork and everything that it stated I was the heir. I waited until all that was made official. And then I was going to go to the Lords of Waterdeep and petition them to reinstate this elven kingdom or whatever and become a lord. And so it was a super fun time. I loved that campaign, the freedom, the actual ability of everybody at the table to kind of roll with the punches. I remember we were using thunder wave or whatever that spell is, to create like, a big distraction because we cast it on a bonfire and that shot the bonfire, flaming pieces of wood out at all the people and the enemies, stuff like that, where we were using the spells and everything creatively, and that just really sent the message home of how creative this game can be and the stories that we could tell. And then lastly, the game that has made kind of the biggest impact on me, and it's less the game and more the setting, is RuneQuest and Glorantha. And this is a setting that has completely transformed how I look at settings and games for that matter. The setting of Glorantha is so baked in to RuneQuest that if you tried to remove the setting, you would be removing rules and mechanics, and the game just wouldn't make sense. That was wild to me, right? Like the Forgotten Realms has a lot of lore, but once you get into play, it doesn't care about any of that, right? We're in the Sword Coast, but like none of that matters. It doesn't really matter if you're from Waterdeep, not mechanically, but RuneQuest, it matters where your homeland is. It gives you certain bonuses and benefits, and it like informs who you are culturally and all of those things. And that is such a novel experience. I'd never experienced anything like that before. And RuneQuest as a entirely classless, levelless, all of this stuff, a complete 180 from my D&D and D20 roots. I don't know that I could ever go back to a class-based system. I am fully bought in to the skill-based system and having my characters be representations of ideas. I've always struggled with that in D&D of like, okay, I want to play a red mage. Okay, well, that's kind of a blade singer, but not really, because I'm not going to be able to do as much, and it's so multi-attribute dependent. So what can I do to actually do that a little bit more? Okay, well, man, this doesn't really work. It's better just to be a wizard. Ah, man, right? There are so many ideas that kind of die on the vine because of the limitations that exist within a class-based structure, balance-wise. And going over to something like RuneQuest that kind of throws that into the wind a little bit was so liberating and so freeing. And then you add in kind of the BRP mechanics on top of that, the roll under system, the skills, the augmenting of a skill where if I'm going to do a dance, I can roll for sing as well. And if I pass on my sing roll, my dance roll is better, right? Like stuff like that was so infinitely cool and informative to me. Like when I think about games now, I don't think about it from a D20 perspective. I think about it from a D100 perspective. That is such a stark shift in the way that I perceive and engage with the hobby as a whole. And then further from more, the realization for me was it was really less about RuneQuest itself. It was more about Glorantha, because RuneQuest Glorantha, as an extenuation of the series of games, was more the things I enjoyed about it largely came from Hero Quest and Hero Wars and Quest Worlds, those narrative systems where they are tag based. Those infinitely appealed to me more. And so that has completely changed how I look at the games, how I engage with everything. And I'm unsure what the future looks like. I don't know what game system is going to crop up next to catch my attention. I am playing Land of Eam. I don't really like PBTA, but Land of Eam, it scratches an itch for me. And it might be the next game that marks a milestone for me. You guys let me know what games made you. I'm really curious to see all of your stories. If you liked this piece of content, like, comment, subscribe, head over to the Patreon and support me. I am super excited to start making content, and I'm super excited for have you guys on this journey. So until next time, I'm LHS, and I'll see you.